Matt Almy, Department of Finance. I think this is going to be a little bit of a team effort here by me and my colleagues in the high-speed rail. So I think what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more broadly about the legal authority of cap and trade post-2020. I know that's been a topic, and then I'm going to turn it back over to talk more about kind of the specifics of securitization and how it relates to the business plan, if that's okay.
And if you don't have that information yet, I'd like to have it. And as part of what Jim is referring to, the chair is referring to as beefing up, I think that's requires a little bit more beefing up as well, perhaps.
So just as was mentioned before, the existing regulation, the existing Air Resources Board cap and trade regulation does in fact expire in 2020. That is true. However, it's also fair to say that the authority under AB 32 does provide authority to continue climate change strategies post-2020. So there is existing authority for post-2020. Admittedly, there is some legal uncertainty about maybe perhaps the scope of that post-2020 authority. The Air Resources Board is in fact holding workshops on its new regulation. So there is authority, and there are going to be continued discussions with the legislature about strengthening that authority post-2020, which of course does provide the necessary structure to achieve the securitization that is contemplated in the business plan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the High-Speed Rail Authority to talk kind of more specifically on the securitization question.
Well, I'll just start and say Chair Wolk, I've been involved in some securitizations in my life, and I think that the questions you raise are certainly appropriate ones. We do indicate in the business plan that without a securitization or borrowing, we can continue to go pay as you go. It would just simply take longer, of course, to build. And so I think we will probably end up supplementing this answer, but I would just say that at the time that one begins to look at the securitization, I think first of all, let me make one other point. I believe I understood Mr. Thompson to say something, and if I understood him correctly, I would agree with it. Irrespective of whether cap and trade itself goes to some point in time, there would need to be specific legislative authorization on securitization, I believe. My colleague Mike Rossi, who is the banker, can tell me if that's right or not, but in my experience, even if there was no question about cap and trade termination date, I think that we would probably need to come to you for authorization to securitize off of that. Although in the existing legislation, I guess the legislature did say we could finance with that. So it'd be up to the council to say whether you've already given us sufficient or we'd need something else. But I would just say to you, Madam Chair, that I think at the time that decision is made, it would need to be the balance of what benefit is there from bringing the construction forward versus the construction costs versus the risk and who is bearing that risk. I agree. And so I think you've laid out what those elements are. Our assumption is that there would be benefit in completing faster, but we would need to weigh all those things, and certainly that would be done in concert with the legislature.
And Mr. Thompson, you had a comment, or Ms. Peter?
Oh, sure, Madam Chair, if I could, I believe your question overall was what is assumed in the business plan in terms of financing costs. And in our review of the business plan, we've identified that there's about $7.5 billion in financing costs in the plan related to the cap and trade securitization. We also, in terms of additional information, one of the things that we point out in our report is that the legislature may want to require more sort of all costs to be included in future business plans. Right now, the authority is complying with state law to provide capital cost estimates, but that doesn't include financing costs and doesn't include some of these other things. And as the project moves forward, you may want to think think about amending the requirements in order to have them provide that information going forward. And I think that would help answer some of your questions in the future. With regard to can they securitize, I think we would think that first that legal question does need to be resolved. Even if it's resolved, we think that additional steps would need to be taken to facilitate the securitization. And I think Mr. Thompson wanted to speak to some of the specific ideas that the private sector had.
Madam Chairman, in the responses that the High-Speed Rail Authority received when they asked the private sector whether they could invest in the project, Barclays Bank, which I think had the best analysis of the cap and trade program, had a response. What they said was, no long-term standalone cap and trade financing is possible unless 4 threshold issues are resolved. First, CARB and High-Speed Rail Authority must prevail against pending legal challenges to the cap and trade program and to the use of GGRF revenues for a high-speed project. Second, the authority needs to create the technical plumbing in the law so that they have the authority to do this. Third, the legislature and CARB respectively must extend the cap and trade program in law and regulation beyond 2020. And fourth, the legislature must protect the 25% of GGRF revenue flowing to the authority from future impairment by the legislature as long as financing obligations are outstanding. So in English, what they said was,
Guarantee.
you got to extend it beyond 2020 to 2050, and you must take some action to ensure that there is a minimum amount of money that comes to High-Speed Rail Authority, and that minimum amount of money cannot be changed by future decisions.
For the duration of the commitment.
Yes, when
So that's the general-
securitization is a simple process. It is, I have a stream of revenue, how much cash will you give me to buy this stream of revenue? And the amount that cash that someone will pay is a function of the uncertainty in that stream of revenue. If it's absolutely certain for 30 years that you'll get $600 million a year, then you get one price that is paid for securitizing the money. If there is a major risk in that, either in amount or in when you will receive it or how you will receive it or the amounts you receive, then the amount, in effect, the cost of securitization goes up significantly. And the way in which that securitization is structured, or the ability to structure it, will go a long way to determine what is the value of the securitization.
Thank you. And I just wanted to compliment you on the high-speed rail peer review group, which has been extremely helpful in
Thank you.
wading through this. I have just one other question. As I look at the realignment, and as I said earlier, I support the effort to fund it and move it forward. A driving force in this is the wonderful and dramatic expansion of the Silicon Valley phenomenon. My question is, when we are confronted with these costs, and we know that Silicon Valley has been, and the firms have been very, very generous in terms of San Francisco and transit and buses. Has anyone from the Valley come forward from that industry to assist with some of this effort, financial effort? Does it make any sense to try?
Madam Chair, I've met.
A station, capital costs.
Well, we don't have that IOU in hand at the moment, but I will say that working with Congresswoman Lofgren, I met with a number of key Silicon Valley companies. One of the companies made the statement that they have supported. I guess I would say politically supported virtually every transportation measure that's ever come forward. And those companies also provide transit assistance packages to their workers and a number of things like that. We're very enthusiastic about the reception that we're getting, not just in Silicon Valley, but also in the Central Valley. And if I might just take a moment here, I'm a Northern Californian and had not spent much time in the Central Valley before this project, before I became involved with this project. There are increasing conversations going on between Silicon Valley companies and economic development interests in Fresno and the Central Valley. And I think that not only the opportunity for housing and jobs connectivity, which is there, are there, but you know, Silicon Valley companies have expanded their operations. Intel, for example, is up in Folsom. There are tremendous opportunities in the Central Valley, I think, not just as a housing location, but for investment there as well. So no one has said yet, gee, we're so excited about this that we're going to write you guys a $5 billion check to help build it. But I do think that the economic uplift and the opportunity that people are seeing, not only for housing jobs balance, but also for a new region for economic investment, are dramatic. And we're already seeing, because of the initial construction of high-speed rail, a very significant economic activity increases in the Central Valley. And we know that in addition to our conversations with tech leaders, that people in Fresno and other places are having those conversations as well. Ultimately, where this leads, I don't want to get ahead of myself on that, but I think your question is an important one, and we see real excitement in terms of the possibilities here that are being expressed in both areas.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Senator Roth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a few questions in a couple areas. First, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm privileged to represent a district in inland Southern California, so I'm familiar with the Metrolink system. With respect to intercity rail improvements in Southern California and what you call bookend projects, I'm a little confused. The LA Times referred to $1 billion of investment in Southern California's transit system, and I thought I heard one of you mention 500 million. Is it 500 million or is it 1 billion? And if so, whichever it is, has the money rolled out or when will it roll out? That's a compound question, but.
Senator, we signed an MOU with the Southern California Association of Governments.
You're on.
I'm sorry, sir. That commits us to $1 billion of total investment from all sources in the Southern California region. The $500 million is a subset of that, and that is what this legislature appropriated of our bond funds in 2012 through Senate Bill 1029. So the commitment is that it would be $500 million of Prop 1A bond funds, and then another $500 million that could come from disparate sources that either could come from us or through our working with them to arrange to get those dollars. And there, I think our partnership with the State Transportation Agency and Secretary Kelly is working very closely to come up with that. But our total commitment is $1 billion.
So the 500 million from Prop 1A, is that already rolled out?
No, sir, because that needs to, we're actually hoping this year to make the push to do that. But as you know, there have been some legal challenges to the use of bond funds, and that has been what has held up those dollars, not only for Southern California, but also for our commitment to Mr. Hartnett's project of the $600 million. And certainly these gentlemen could explain if they see it differently.
But so once the legal challenge is resolved, the money will roll?
That's
as
correct.
to the 500 million?
That's correct.
And what about the second 500 million? What action does that take? Does that take further appropriation by this legislative body?
I don't believe it does, but let me just ask Mr. Morales to.
It would ultimately depend on the source of those funds, but that's what we're working with Metrolink, Metro, and others in Southern California to look at now, or what are the potential sources of funds that could contribute, combined in many cases with local monies so that we can leverage dollars to get more projects done.
But in the end, somebody other than local agencies will be coming up with an additional 500 million.
Right. Yes.
And you do not have, I guess, at this point, is what you're telling me, a target date by which both pieces totaling $1 billion will roll to the local agencies?
The MOU actually had a number of things in it, but the overall commitment was by 2020 to have those investments made.
Okay.
So that remains the target.
Okay. My next question has to do with cost estimates in this iOS North that's proposed to cost, I guess, about $28 billion. You know, let me just say this about cap and trade. 2020 is a long time from now. There'll be a change in administration, some change in this legislature. And from my personal perspective, I don't personally view the cap and trade account generally as an infrastructure financing bank. So if, in fact, cap and trade goes away or is substantially changed to interfere with your ability to access the $17.8 billion or $18 billion that you need, what will we be left with at that point in time? Is it the Madeira to Shafter line? Is that a fair question?
It's a fair question.
We need to plan.
Yeah, I mean, Senator, it's a fair question because this program has always faced that question. And the Bond Act says a couple things that are very pertinent here. First of all, the bonds can never be more than 50% of any share of any segment that we build. It was intended that they be matched by other dollars. And so the first question is, if matches go away, we have to find other matches for them. One of the issues that was in front of the legislature in 2012 was that because we're allowed to build this system in segments, it's always going to be the case that the first segment is going to be the riskiest. That was the question that the legislature had to deal with when it looked at the appropriation for the Central Valley. What we said, and what I believe it's fair to say the legislature accepted at that time, is that if, heaven forbid, that's the only segment that's built or the only segment that's built for a while, it does have independent utility because that could substantially increase passenger rail service in that area and free up freight capacity. That line down through Central California, the San Joaquin's rail service right now is the 5th busiest Amtrak line in the United States, and there's something like 1.2 million passengers per year on it. It's about a 5-hour trip up from Bakersfield here, and when you have freight and passenger rail sharing a segment, it's limited by federal regulation to 79 miles an hour. So we're building a line that could, if necessary, be tied in to the existing Amtrak service so that those Amtrak trains could run on that line. Now, no one would say that we wanted to spend $6 billion to build a better passenger line in the Central Valley. That was not the point. But the point was that if we are left with that for some period of time, it does have independent utility. And Mr. Morales and I were just in one of our regular meetings with the Federal Railroad Administration, which wants to look very closely at how we effectuate that. Even in the interim, before we get the full iOS built, that line will be there. So it's a fair question. I hope that that's a fair answer.
Good answer. The last couple questions I have to do with transparency and integrity and the cost and the schedule estimates that have been floating. And there were some, to me anyway, disturbing articles in the Los Angeles Times having to do with some cost reports. And I'd like to ask about it and give you an opportunity to talk to us about them. The first has to do with this 2013 Parsons-Brinkerhoff report. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Yes, sir.
I assume the authority commissioned it.
Yeah, well, commission is maybe not the right verb.
Contracted for it.
Parsons-Brinkerhoff has been a major contractor for the project. And I'd like to share my answer with, actually, you want to start with?
Yeah, let me jump in, Senator. First, I think it's important to note that the characterization of what that document was completely erroneous in the story.
Part of the problem was it wasn't released to begin with, so people are free to characterize a document that they get, you know, the way, that's just the way it works when you don't release it, but go ahead.
Well, we get, as we put together cost estimates, and we update them every 2 years for the business plan, we get dozens, if not hundreds, of inputs into those estimates, and we look at them, determine if they're reasonable or not, if they have basis behind them or not. There were some things in that report which was characterized, and this was erroneous, this was not a matter of interpretation. What was characterized as a confidential report was in fact a draft PowerPoint. That's how it was marked for internal staff discussion. One of the issues in that report was looking at lengthening the section between the Central Valley and Southern California that contributed to cost increase. If you lengthen the section in a heavily urbanized area, which was what it was in the San Fernando Valley, there's a cost increase. That's not cost growth, that's a change in the scope because you're moving it from one to the other.
And this was Burbank to Merced, right?
Correct. And the original plan was in fact terminated at Sylmar, and what was considered in that document was an extension from Sylmar to Burbank, some of the most heavily congested areas in the state. And so there was a concurrent cost increase with that, cost of that added length. Ultimately, we decided in that plan not to create that extension. And so the cost increase didn't materialize because there was none there associated with it.
So just so I'm clear, my understanding is the 2013 Parsons Brinkerhoff quote report, was it a written report plus a PowerPoint or just a PowerPoint?
Just a PowerPoint.
PowerPoint, we'll call it what it was or is, reflected a cost increase of from 31 billion to 40 billion, correct?
I think it was
Well,
31%.
it didn't actually. The reporter made some
The reporter calculated those
calculations
numbers
on his own.
So what was the cost increase?
It was, well, again, it was a series of potential changes that not all of which ultimately became changes.
If I might,
more or less.
there was, my recollection, and I apologize, Senator, because we had all this information, which actually was the subject or became subject of a hearing on the Assembly side. And just to fill out what my colleague was saying, so first of all, it was 2013. It was a draft PowerPoint. It was not a report. It was not secret. It was a draft. We get lots of draft documents. When the reporter asked us for it, he didn't identify it. We would have given it maybe, although we generally don't give out drafts because they have a tendency to be misinterpreted. My recollection of it was that it claimed, according to this, that there was going to be a 31% increase. I think that was the number going south. What the Times story did not mention was it also foresaw what turned out to be very significant decreases in the northern segment. That was left out of the article.
And that was the segment from Merced to
San Jose, basically.
San Jose.
Right. So ultimately, when you looked at all of that document imagined a 2.5% increase in the cost of the project. Now, between then and the time that we adopted the next business plan.
2014.
Yes, sir. We did not include those cost increases, and we very deliberately did not include cost increases at that point. I had never seen this PowerPoint, by the way, at the board. Didn't come to us at that level. But our conversations at that point were that, number one, inflation had really not grown between 2012 and 2014 in any material way in the business plan. We already had baked in 3% annual inflation numbers. Number two, we were starting to get bids in, and the bids coming in on the project were coming in substantially below the engineer's estimates in the Central Valley. So we looked at all those things together, and we decided to hold our costs at that time at the level that we held them. And there was no real magic to it beyond that.
So did the 2014 business plan, the authority's business plan, include the Merced to Burbank or Burbank to Merced route?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so there was a decision made at the board level not to use the lower figure because of cost reductions that were projected?
We basically, at that point, said that the information we had in front of us made the most sense to just hold the numbers we had. We had some puts and takes. And by the way, in this business plan, what you would see is that we have increased the cost of going south. We have provided a higher number for that and decreased the cost of going north. So these things are always moving, and we can go into the reasons for all that.
Well, did the board, did you, at the time that the 2014 business plan was approved, know of the Parsons-Brinkerhoff estimate and make a conscious decision to not use those numbers?
Can I just correct one thing, sir? Parsons-Brinkerhoff never, let me answer your question this way, which I think is the most appropriate way to answer it. When this story broke, I called our top guy from Parsons-Brinkerhoff and I said this to him. Are there people from your company walking around believing that we're using the wrong set of numbers? This was one PowerPoint, one group of engineers based on essentially looking, as I understand it, at comparable tunneling around the world. Now, we've already been told by other consultants that they think our tunneling costs are too high. And I asked the head of Parsons-Brinkerhoff on our team, are there people from your organization running around thinking that we're using the wrong numbers? And he said no. So this was not an official Parsons-Brinkerhoff recommendation to us. It essentially was some deliberative process that people went through. And as Mr. Morales said, it was one of hundreds of inputs that go into recommendations to the board for costs. And because it was highlighted in the way it was highlighted in the press, it has taken on an outsized importance compared to other inputs that we had. So that's the best answer I can give you, Senator.
And that may very well be true, but of course, you know, in the interests of oversight, bodies such as this need complete data, and had we had that data, we may too have rejected it for all the reasons that you provide this afternoon. But I think, you know, on a going forward basis, I think it's incumbent on the authority to make sure somehow that differences of opinion are highlighted and your reasons for selecting one position over the other are noted. There's one last question, and it's...
I would agree with that, Senator.
And it's somewhat along the same lines. There was another, I guess this was 2015 LA Times, October 2015 LA Times story, and it says, last year, San Francisco engineering firm URS prepared a planning document that projected an increase of 15% or nearly $1 billion in the cost of building the line from Bakersfield to Fresno. URS said it had been instructed, that's in quotes, by the state to hold costs to the same level as 2012, but that the company was refusing to do so. Now, I don't know whether that's true or false, but is that something you can comment on?
Well, first I can say it's false, and then do you want to go into...
Sure. Again, Senator, I would say when we go through the estimating process, and the estimating process we use is not something we created. There's actually there's an American Association of Cost Engineers who put together procedures, and we follow those processes, and it's independently audited and has been looked at by the federal government independently to ensure we're following those procedures. There's something like 20,000 inputs that go into the estimates. That means, you know, hundreds and hundreds of discussions and meetings to look at all those assumptions. Are they valid? Are they not? Are they reasonable? Are they not? And so, you know, to look at any one document and try to suggest that was a definitive answer really doesn't represent how the process actually works in this. Going back to your earlier example, you know, we talked about not only the length, two key assumptions that were behind what was characterized as a cost increase were 16 miles of length, and another was that design changes would be made to go from at-grade infrastructure to elevated. Elevated infrastructure costs significantly more than at-grade, and that was an assumption made by a working level engineer, and that was not accepted, and we said we don't want to go elevated if we can stay at grade. That's been validated in the bids we've seen in the Central Valley. So there's a constant back and forth in looking at these under accepted industry practices to look at all these things, and ultimately that's what comes out in the final estimate.
Well, this URS example, again, I'm just reading the newspaper, so you can take that for what it is, but it says instructed by the state to hold costs to the same level as 2012. in a planning document. Did that occur?
Senator, I'd have to go back and look at the particulars. I can tell you, what we certainly say is if we don't have justification for changing a cost, to the good or to the bad, either way, we don't do it arbitrarily. And so, we don't take, if there's not a valid reason for making a cost change, we don't make it.
But you would simply reject the URS planning document, right, instead of telling URS what to put in it?